You need to watch this if you struggle with understanding the rapid rise and fall of iconic brands. The Hummer is one of those things that was seemingly everywhere for a few years before quickly fading away. I would qualify it as a fairly rapid rise and fall, considering that the entirety of its original production run lasted for less than 20 years, with it being culturally significant for probably less than half of that. I do not think anything can illustrate that better than this graph showing how many of them were sold each year. I think it is wild that Hummer reached its peak in popularity in 2006 by selling over 70,000 vehicles. And only a few years later, in May of 2010, it was all over when production was completely shut down. I am always interested in things that rise and fall so quickly like this, because they typically capture a moment in time and therefore become nostalgic for a lot of people, including myself to an extent. I was a teenager in 2006, back when everyone was talking about them, and I can tell you firsthand that whenever there was a Hummer driving down the road, it would capture everyone's attention. Now, sometimes it was positive and sometimes it was negative, but people had strong opinions about it. Honestly, this might somehow be one of the coolest and most ridiculous vehicles that has ever been mass-produced. So, in this video, I want to talk about this unique story by outlining the rise and the fall of Hummer. The first part of this is the Hummer. I think almost anyone would agree that the Hummer was not the most practical car for multiple reasons, but a lot of it stems from the fact that it was originally designed as a military vehicle, not intended for everyday use by public consumers. The Jeep would be a much earlier example of a military vehicle that was adopted for consumer use in the 1940s, following World War II. Well, there's a lot to this, but in the 1970s, American Motors Corporation bought the company that made Jeeps and established a new subsidiary from it called AM General that would make vehicles for the military. By the end of that decade, AM General was designing a high-mobility, multi-purpose, wheeled vehicle, a HMMUV, that thankfully they simplified to be pronounced as Humvee. As the name implies, it was this massively powerful and durable vehicle made to navigate through different terrains. Simply put, Humvee was sort of meant to be the bigger and better version of the Jeep. In 1983, AM General won a $1 billion Army contract to start producing thousands of them that proved to be especially useful for traveling around the desert during the Gulf War in the early 1990s. That is where a lot of the US public first became aware of the Humvee, by watching news reports about the war. The president even rode in one of them to visit the troops. I think you can understand why most people had a very positive perception of these vehicles at this point. They were being seen in almost heroic settings, defending or rescuing troops and transporting important figures through dangerous areas. When you think about it, I can't even imagine a more effective way to demonstrate the reliability and durability of a vehicle like this. So naturally, Humvees developed a bit of a fan base, people admiring them from a distance that would likely buy one if given the opportunity. Arnold Schwarzenegger was one of these admirers. It looks wonderful. It is so great when you sit in this car. He contacted AM General and helped them realize how much demand there was for them to make a few adjustments, like adding an air conditioner and a radio to create a civilian version of it. So I said, well, I think it's about time to just start selling it to civilians because it's the best vehicle in the market. And that is exactly what they did, leading me right into the next part, the Hummer. In 1992, the Hummer was released in the United States, with the first one being sold to Arnold Schwarzenegger himself. Now, arguably, AM General could have done a little more to make sure that the vehicle was more consumer-friendly. It was criticized for safety because it lacked airbags and child safety locks. It was criticized for its size, leading to poor gas mileage and trouble fitting into most parking spots. And it was expensive. As a result, sales were slow. Over that first decade, AM General sold less than 10,000 of them in total, reflecting the fact that the Hummer had an extremely narrow customer base. To me, it was the kind of vehicle that people were happy to admire from a distance, but you had to almost be obsessed with it to overlook those negative aspects and buy one for yourself. That is how Hummer existed throughout the 1990s. Obviously not a sensation by any means, but still an interesting vehicle with a small but dedicated following. In 1999, General Motors was still the largest automaker in the world when they made a deal with AM General to buy the rights to market and distribute the Hummer. That was a massive deal for the brand because shortly after GM became involved, they renamed the original Hummer the H1 and released an updated version of it, taking me straight into the next part, the H2. Without getting too specific about the differences, it addressed most of those original criticisms to an extent. The H2 was smaller, less expensive, and considered to be safer than the one before it, though it was still more excessive than most other vehicles on the market. But holy cow, those adjustments combined with the marketing and distribution power of General Motors made the H2 far more popular than most people had predicted. Celebrities started driving it that probably would not have been attracted to the original version. And it was the center of a crazy sequence in the movie Bad Boys 2. LeBron James, before he was in the NBA, was investigated by the Ohio High School Athletic Association after receiving one from his mother that she had financed for his 18th birthday. I'm just trying to give a few examples here to express how suddenly the H2 was all over the place. And looking back at that sales graph, we can see that the popularity skyrocketed when it was released in 2002. The Hummer was no longer an obscure vehicle limited to a narrow customer base. We're now talking about mainstream popularity. Then in 2005, it was almost like a repeat when the H3 was released. Again, it was smaller and cheaper, and it caused a resurgence. And sales, well, that was short-lived. By 2007, sales were already starting to fall. By 2008, as sales continued to fall, General Motors was actively looking for someone to buy the brand. In 2009, a deal was made to sell it to a lesser-known company in China that specialized in making heavy machinery. By 2010, that deal had fallen apart when the Chinese company was unable to get the deal approved by their government. So, a few months later, everything was shut down and the Hummer brand was discontinued. I know a lot was happening during that time. Here's an article about it that starts by saying, General Motors Company will wind down its iconic but tarnished Hummer brand, which is a harsh but probably accurate way to put it. It is like things just kept getting worse and worse. As you can already tell, we are now getting to the more depressing part of the video, where I attempt to explain what happened during the decline of Hummer. Before I say anything else, I want to re-emphasize that adapting the Humvee into the Hummer was probably not the most practical idea. From the beginning, that vehicle was designed for environments and circumstances that are far more extreme than the average consumer will ever encounter. In other words, the Hummer is a little excessive at its core. If I had to break down the downfall into a single reason, I would say that Hummer simply used too much gas, and I realize that might sound absurd at first to suggest that an entire brand of vehicles was shut down because they were not fuel efficient enough. But hear me out here, the fuel efficiency of these vehicles was so bad that I would guess the term gas guzzler has been used to describe the Hummer more than any other vehicle ever produced. It became the prime example when talking about something that was not fuel efficient. Even the H2, the more popular, smaller, more fuel-efficient version, still weighed around 3 tons, which was so heavy that it never received an official fuel economy rating from the EPA. Because I guess the way the laws were at the time meant that vehicles above a certain weight were exempt from it, but estimates it placed it to be as low as 10 miles per gallon in the city. On one end, fuel efficiency is a concern because of the impact on the environment. I'm not going to make this political in any way, but the 2000s was a time of growing environmental awareness. Hybrid cars like the Toyota Prius were becoming the next big thing, and the Al Gore documentary An Inconvenient Truth was released in 2006, the peak year for sales for the Hummer. On the other end, fuel efficiency is a concern to people because it can cost a lot of money. Hummer sales were declining as people were feeling the effects of the recession, and fuel prices were hitting an all-time high. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average price for a gallon of gas in the U.S. more than doubled over the 6 years following 2002, when the H2 was introduced. I mean, people were actively protesting Hummer. In 2003, there was a more extreme incident where 20 H2S were set on fire at a dealership. Going back to Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was getting a lot of backlash for driving such fuel-inefficient vehicles during his time as the 2008 financial crisis was a pivotal moment for many industries, and the automotive sector was no exception. The Hummer, already facing criticism for its fuel inefficiency and environmental impact, was hit hard by the recession. As consumers tightened their belts and prioritized more economical and sustainable options, the demand for high-priced, gas-guzzling vehicles like the Hummer plummeted. For General Motors, the parent company of Hummer, the financial strain was overwhelming. In 2009, GM filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, a move that forced the company to reassess its portfolio and make some tough decisions. Amidst the restructuring, GM decided to discontinue several of its underperforming brands, and Hummer was on the chopping block. The financial crisis not only accelerated Hummer's decline, but also underscored the shifting priorities of consumers and the auto industry. It was a stark reminder that even the most iconic brands are not immune to economic downturns and changing market dynamics. The once mighty Hummer, a symbol of power and excess, found itself at odds with a world that was increasingly valuing efficiency and sustainability. As the dust settled, the Hummer brand became a relic of a bygone era, a casualty of financial instability and evolving consumer preferences. But as we've seen, the story didn't end there. The question remains, can Hummer reinvent itself for a new generation? Or will it remain a nostalgic memory of the early 2000s? Governor of California. During his campaign, he said that he would transform one of his Hummers to be hydrogen-powered, and he did work with GM to have a hydrogen-fueled prototype created. But I guess it needed to be refueled every 50 miles, so again, kind of impractical. During that time, it was reported that he sold 4 of his 7 Hummers and hardly drove the other ones anyway. And then later on, reports were saying that he was selling the rest of them. So that is an issue when someone who was once Hummer's biggest advocate starts to